Good evening. It is February 20th. It is 6 p.m. and I am calling to order the work session. It's been discussed and we've been looking forward to this, and we are anxious to get a full briefing on our drainage situation. I'll turn it over to the city manager.
Mayor and council, we appreciate the opportunity and appreciate y'all dedicating this evening to talk just about drainage. Prior to my being hired in March of last year, the city of Bastrop contracted in partnership with Bastrop County to have half associates study not only Gills Branch but Piney Creek flood protection. And they are here tonight to walk you through their findings, and that's going to be agenda item 2A. Kathy Hopkins is with the Texas Water Development Board, and she is going to talk about what this study, the impact this study will have on future FEMA floodplain maps. And then on item 2C, I don't like studying things unless we do something about it. So item 2C, Wesley is going to go back and kind of give the blonde version of the salient points, because y'all are going to be drinking from a fire hose tonight. There's going to be a lot of information. And then there's not going to be an obvious answer. So we'll talk about what are the next steps and how do we take this information and come to some conclusion between April and August when we build the budget. So just know we're going to start at the beginning and end with an action plan. And if at any point in time you have questions during the discussion, they are available to assist. So with Halfin Associates, we have Dan Yates in the blue shirt, Paul Morales sitting next to him, and they are going to take us on a very interesting journey about Gills Branch and Piney Creek. So, gentlemen, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Linda. So tonight we'll be talking about Gills Branch and Piney Creek, and just a quick outline. We'll go over, there's a history to this project in that it's been ongoing. It's part of an ongoing project that's been going since 2007. And then I'll give a little bit of a introduction to some of the components that go into a floodplain study, so we can get some background on what actually happens in a floodplain study. And then I'll do a little primer on hydrology and hydraulics. You'll hear guys like me talk a lot about H&H, and that's what we're talking about, is hydrology and hydraulics. And then we'll get down to the specifics of Gills Branch and Piney Creek. We'll take them in that order. Start with Gills and go to Piney. So the Bastrop County Flood Protection Plan studies, they got their start all the way back in 2007 when Bastrop County, in coordination with, I believe, CAPCOG and Texas Water Development Board, the Army Corps of Engineers, and other participants, cooperated in getting a countywide set of LIDAR. LIDAR is what you call light detection and ranging. It's a data set that describes the elevation to a really high resolution. So this project started with that. That was phase one. And then they went on to do, is there a pointer on this guy?
I don't think it'll show up on the TV screen.
Oh, okay. Well, you can see in the orange and the blue are the first two studies that got taken. There's Dry Creek East and then Cedar Creek. That watershed was studied, both the hydrology and the hydraulics. Then that went through, that was phase 1B, which got through to 2010, where phase 2 began. And the phase 2 work was rudely interrupted by the terrible fire. So at that point, Bastrop County stepped back for a time period and then came back in 2014 and picked up with the Walnut Creek study, which is the purple shaded watershed. And then they went on to, I think the city of Smithville joined the party and studied Willow and Gasly Creek in Smithville, Texas. Currently, what we're talking about tonight is Piney Creek and Gills Branch. So this has been, it got started back over 10 years ago. So it's a very fruitful partnership between the Water Development Board and the county and now the city. Sure.
Can you tell me again what LIDAR is?
LIDAR, yeah. Let's move to the next slide.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Let's talk about some fun stuff. So floodplain studies include a whole lot of different data, and I'm going to go through each of these kinds of quickly, but LIDAR is a description of a ground surface. We use an airplane and laser technology to gather the elevation data of this ground surface. That data set ends up becoming the input data for us to derive drainage areas and cross sections. So we also use survey data, where you send out a survey team to come out and survey cross section data, streets, bridges. The first part of the first H is hydrology. That's the part where we use land use and land cover terminology. And then there's cross section data where you put that into your hydrology model. All of these pieces go together and eventually become your flood insurance rate maps. The first. So hydrology, that's the first part. That's how you're measuring how much water gets to the creek. So rainfall hits the ground and it's either absorbed or turned into runoff, and it makes its way to the watershed outlet. There's a couple of different inputs to that. Obviously, you need rainfall, and then you have your topography, your ground surface, your soils, which help you describe the land surface, and then land use. Once you've come up with how much water is getting to the outlet, then the next step is hydraulics, and that's where you are looking for how high the water gets in the river. So when it's in the river, hydraulics will tell you how high it gets in the river. So let's go a little bit. Let's get in here. So we're going to start with Gills Branch. Paul jumped in here.
Are you guys clear on that? Does that kind of tell you how these kind of come together? You have to look at how the water is generated, and once it's generated and gets into that water or that creek, how does it move through the creek and get out of the system?
So to add to Wesley, once we determine the total amount of peak flow getting to the creek, the hydraulics determines how much conveyance or how much flow area we have in the creek, and determines what the water surface elevation is, and that helps us determine how wide the floodplain is, depending on how much flow is going through the creek. So it basically pushes the water through the creek, fills the creek up, and then fills out the floodplain. So it's not local drainage per se that's coming to the creek. It's more of a riverine study than a local drainage type study, if that makes sense.
So they fly a plane overhead for LIDAR. They do some ground survey. They put all that together, and it determines the basins, and all the basins drain into the channel or the ditch. And that's where they come back with these different watersheds that drain into there. And what they're talking about, the flow and how the floodplain and where it ends up.
So the LIDAR data that was, purchased by the county as part of the FPP study, that's being used for all the data that we're using to develop for each of the watersheds to come up with the peak flows, as well as the hydraulic analysis, and to determine how wide that floodplain is and how deep it is. And so once we go through our analysis, we're able to determine what properties are in the floodplain, what roads are being overtopped, as well as what structures are inside the floodplain, and what the depth of the water is within those structures, based off some assumptions on what the finished floor elevation is of each of the structures.
So,
isn't there assumption up front on how much rain or water you're going to get?
Yes. The And the data set that's used is brought to us by we get it from the USGS for the national, actually there's a Texas rainfall atlas that was published in 2004. So that's the level of data we're using right now for the rainfall input. Okay. And they analyzed rainfall gauge data across the state and then put their statistics to it. And so the storm that we're using for this guy is a 24-hour storm. And it has certain frequency levels of 2, 5, 10, the 25, and the 100-year event that you've probably heard that terminology before.
Before we get too far,
Sure.
I think that it's important for us to go back and explain to the public that why this is so important, that this data did not exist in this form and that y'all are creating new information, and kind of give the history of how the study even started, why it was important. I realize we kind of started toward the beginning of the conversation and not necessarily at the beginning of the conversation.
Yeah, the current flood insurance study for Gills Branch and for Piney Creek and a few other streams in the region was 1991. So that was when it was published. So since then, there have been much advances in data. Like there was not a LiDAR data set with a detailed description of your elevation down to the every 3 feet sort of data set that we're using now. And also let me crank through some of these slides and I'll show you some of the good data that we're talking about. The technology, both in methods and in the input data and in the precipitation records that you just mentioned, since between 1991 and the 2004 data set that we use currently, there's been quite a bit of an update. So, yeah.
So before Dan moves to the next slide, the current floodplain FEMA maps are based off of existing data at the time of the study. So that was back in, when was the FEMA study done? In 1991 is when it was published. So from 91 to 2016, 2017, the current floodplains don't accurately depict what the floodplain and what the flows are because development has progressed since then. And so our current studies take into account existing conditions and existing development that is in place right now. So it's a much better product and a much better defined floodplain because we have newer development information within the city of Bastrop and within the county. And then we also have better terrain to have a better depiction of what the floodplain extents look like.
All right, so on the screen right now, you're seeing that black outline is the watershed for Gills Branch. It's about 2.8 square miles, and within that area, everything flows to Gills Branch or down there all the way down to the outlet where it meets the Colorado River. So the way we built that is using the LiDAR data that I mentioned. This is what it looks like. You can see the terrain. The higher elevations are in white, and then they go through the browns and the reds and the yellows and the greens on down to the light blue down at the Colorado River. So Gills Branch is unique in that it has these larger drainage areas off to the east of 95 that are very steep, and they generate quite a bit of flow, and it makes its way either to Gills Branch or down to the flats just to the east of 95. So, excuse me, to the west of 95. So you've got some very productive basins up here, and basically everything is trying to make its way to Gills Branch and on down to the Colorado River. So this is what the data set that we use to derive these watersheds. We break these, you see the red lines, we divide the basin up based on its either a tributary or a road crossing or a confluence of a tributary so that we properly model the hydrologic response of the basin. So it's divvied up into sub-basins. You got the big basin, it's divvied up into sub-basins. And on average, I think we've got little bitty ones and then up to a half a mile sub-basins in here. But on average, they're about 0.2 square miles apiece, and there's 16 of them in this model. So this is what that LiDAR data looks like. It's zoomed out super high up in the air, but that's the elevation specified every 3 feet. So LiDAR is pretty fun. It can be challenging. It's a complex process to where they fly over and then they're able to use math to take away all the trees, take away all the structures, get it down to what they call a bare earth model. And that's what we use to define the drainage area. Because one cell, one little elevation will be draining to another, which drains to another, and we accumulate those and we build this drainage area like this. And so Bastrop County participated in the funding and the project to get, this was the first step in the project back in 07, 08. Here's what some of the other data that goes into it. We've got the soils database.
Councilmember Peterson, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, I do have a question, Mayor. Thank you. I am just wondering how much of your data is incorporated with the Corps of Engineers? And the reason I'm asking this is because I live on Gills Branch.
Yes, sir.
And I built my home in 05. And the next year, the Corps of Engineers came in and said, I'm in the floodplain, which I had no idea that I was because, and they could not give me a reason that they expanded the floodplain, and the floodplain goes out. This is MLK, and MLK Street right here, and it goes out. The floodplain is extended into the center of MLK. It doesn't expand over to the school, which is right across the street from me. And I'm trying to figure out why they expanded the floodplain a year after I built my home to put me in the floodplain.
I'm assuming, when did you build your home?
05.
That's a good question. But if you look at the map here, maybe this will give you some, you're in that far corner, give you some landmarks. I know I need to
share
look
some information with me. That's all I'm asking.
I would imagine because they got some more updated information.
Mhm.
And once they got more updated information, they updated the maps.
Councilmember Pearson, the latest flood maps that we have now are technically dated 2006. That's when they were updated. It was in 2006.
We are currently using Corps of Engineers methodology as part of our study. So we're using whatever information we can gather from the Corps of Engineers. But as far as the Corps of Engineers defining a floodplain, it's usually FEMA that defines that floodplain unless they've hired the Corps of Engineers to do that analysis. So I guess we're not aware of a Corps of Engineers study that has redefined the FEMA floodplain. If you can share that information, we'd love to see it.
You bet. Matter of fact, I went online and checked on why the Corps expanded it, and they wouldn't tell me why, but they did expand the floodplain in 06. Absolutely. That's when they expanded it.
Yeah, if you do have that information, we'd love to compare it to our current analysis to see
You
how
bet.
it
All right.
compares. That'd be great.
Okay.
Thank you.
So back to soils. This is another, I'm going to show you guys some of the more other data sets we use, just beside, not just elevation. We talk about what the constituent material is based of. So this is the soils database for the Gills Branch watershed. It comes from the federal government. It's the SERGO database is what they call it. That's the National Resources Conservation System. So we're able we're able to specify the particular characteristics of the soil, most notably the permeability, so that we're able to characterize that permeability and include that in our calculation. And then From there, we've got another great data set. This came from the city of Bastrop. This is land use. It comes from the comprehensive plan. And you can see that takes into account the things that are going on, from either vacant to single-family residential to retail to multifamily residential. And then impervious cover is another variable in the calculation. So all these things are taken into account for each subbasin, and then that helps us generate the rainfall runoff for that subbasin. This is what it looks like when we get it in a model, and you can see how the connectivity for the model, it starts way up at GB01. That's what we call Gills Branch 01. That's how we numbered the numbering convention. And then the watersheds make their way down to the outlet. So everybody's connected topologically, and GB01, which flows into GB02, and so on and so forth until you get down to the mouth of the river. Here's what the results look like. This is our model with the node and network that shows that connectivity that I was talking about on the previous slide. But if you look at the chart there, on the top part of that chart, that's the rainfall. That's a depiction of the rainfall for that event. And then just below it is a depiction of the runoff. So we've got so many inches of rain hitting around midnight, and then about an hour or two later you can see that the runoff peaks. So you got rainfall on top and runoff below. And here's just another one that shows you, this is another hydrograph further downstream that shows how the hydrographs add up. So you've got the flow accumulating by the time you make your way downstream.
Hey, Dan, can you go back?
Sure.
If you can, it's hard to see on that hydrograph, that blue line that kind of goes up to a peak and then comes back down. The very top of that hydrograph is the total amount of flow coming down Gills Branch. And that is, it looks like it's about, is that almost 4,500 CFS?
Yes, at that point in the watershed, yeah.
And that's the point flowing into the Colorado River that Gills Branch is trying to convey through its system. So just to kind of give you an idea of how much flow that is, one gate at Mansfield Dam is about 5,000 CFS. So if you can imagine, this is trying to convey almost one gate that's fully open at Mansfield Dam, which is conveying about 5,000 CFS. We're trying to convey 4,500 CFS through downtown.
Just for perspective, that's over 2 million gallons per minute.
Yeah.
And so you think, Trey, what do our water wells run at?
That is about your peak flow in the summer that we use daily in water usage. 2 million a day. And it's coming out in 1 minute, that's right.
And guys, for the record, I mentioned the Corps of Engineers. The report that I read, the Corps stated in their results of looking at Gills Branch, it all came out to where if Gills Branch is cleaned of all debris, they could probably go back and reduce the floodplain. And this is the report that I read. But it's been some years since I read the report. And if you guys go back and look at Corps of Engineers, talk about Gills Branch, you will see the same report that I read already.
That's coming up.
Is that flow where it hits the Colorado, or is that flow all the way along the...
It grows.
So
it gets more and more as you make your way downstream.
Right.
So the flows do accumulate. Yeah, the 4,500 is actually that hydrograph right there. That 4,500 is just right around where MLK and Gills Branch meet.
Okay.
So by the time it gets all the way down to the Colorado, it's up to close to 6,000. If you start all the way up at the top of Gills Branch at Highway 95, it's in the 3,000 range.
Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, it accumulates as you make your way downstream.
That's where I was going, was where does that figure?
Yes, sir.
Work?
So we've got rainfall, we've got runoff. We know the volume of that runoff. Now the next trick is to work on it in the river. And how high does that mean? How high is that in the creek? Like, what's that elevation? So that's for the second H, the hydraulics. And we use another model that looks very similar, except we're talking about, instead of a large watershed, we're talking about a channel, the channel of the Gills Branch. And then Gills Branch is unique in that it overflows its, what I call its right bank. If you're looking downstream, the right bank would be to your right. So we've had to include a second reach in this model, what we're calling the railroad reach. So there is along the railroad, we have a model for that reach too. So those two combine further downstream, but we had to put in two rivers in here to properly characterize what was going on. So you've calculated at every one of these little cross sections, each one of those green lines will have a water surface elevation calculated. When we have that, then you can take that number or those numbers and you put them on the map. You use that detailed LiDAR data combined with the survey data that helps you even get finer resolution, and you map it. So whatever that elevation is at that cross section and the next one downstream, that's how you map it and you get the floodplain map. This output right here, what this guy looks like right here. So that's the next slide. And we can talk about the map here. I'll try to choose the mic out a lot. I'm going to use this camera. You want to widen that. So you can see this is the deep blue part, and then this crosshatched part is what we're calling overflow. So along here, along this right bank, when Gills gets gorged, overflows, it starts to make its way across here. So you'll see it. Wesley told me he saw this in person in 2016, first-hand account. So that's what happens. And then this branch right here is getting flow from upstream combined with that. So that's what you see here. So this is what we've derived as the 100-year floodplain using the methods we just taught you about. So this is Gills Branch, what we're going to refer to as existing conditions 100-year for this study. And we can go a little bit. I think I got another. So to just a little bit more about that effect, you can see on this guy. So we're looking at Gills Branch as it makes its way downstream, and then this cross section that you see right here is if you drew a line from Highway 95 over to the railroad tracks, this is what the elevation looks like. So this gives you an idea. Flow makes its way to Gills Branch, and when it fills up, it continues, and we're trying to be artful here. You can see how it makes its way over down here to the railroad. So.
This is a good point to bring up here. This riverine analysis is not simple at all. Because typically what we, as rock engineers, we typically do a study and we focus on the riverine itself. And the terrain naturally tends to come back up and define actually the east part of the floodplain is thickening on either side of the creek. In this instance, as you can see on the arrow, looking downstream while we're standing in the middle of the creek, once the creek starts to fill up, one side's higher than the other, and it never gets back into the creek. It continues to flow over them towards the road. So we're trying to
this creek fills up, it breaks its bank and starts to sheet flow through these rock catching area and causes significant clogging behind the railroad, which is causing a trail dam. So this whole area became a really complex analysis for us because we're working in a one-dimensional model. We only know waterfront elevations and cross-section of stuff. So to get a full understanding of this, there's some next steps that we're eventually going to talk about to better understand what's happening.
So I added this guy just to make the point, just not to belabor the point, but you can see how the elevation, as it goes from the yellows to the greens down to the blue, it's trying to make its way to the Colorado River. So just another visual here to show what happens when Gills gets out of its banks. Okay, so this gets us to the conceptual mitigation alternatives that we investigated as part of this report. I've got a little bit of a detail here about the different kinds of mitigations that we investigated. So I was wondering, please note that these are conceptual analyses. This is a high-level study, so these are not plans or for engineering or design.
I think we can look at this as nothing more than a scope of magnitude.
Okay, so we're talking about the structural mitigation alternatives that we have in our tool set. Obviously, one of the first things we could look at is improving road crossings or railroad crossings. So you can improve the conveyance of the stream by improving the opening and the crossing so that it's able to let more water by without stacking up behind the structure. Or you can improve the channel itself. So we investigated channel benching, which is detailed here in this drawing. It shows the existing ground was the black line, and then you bench into the side slope, and then you slope it up, and you're able to gain all that area there for flow to make its way through. So you get more room for the river to take care of its business. Here's what it looks like in our world, with the black being the incised original channel and the red being a proposed benching option for that cross section. And then we looked at stormwater detention, the concept being there that if you've got flow coming in, you hold it so that you can store that volume and then release it at a much lower flow rate so that you decrease those peak flows in the main channel. It's a hold them and let it go. So we looked at, and it's detention. It's not retention. It's not holding on to the water. It's something that stays empty most of the time, except when it's doing its job, which is grabbing water and holding it back and then releasing it slower. So we looked at three different concepts here. So the first one that we investigated is down here, right here, where the railroad goes over Gills Branch down here. Prior to hitting the railroad, Gills Branch, oh, that was cool. Looking for mine. Prior to hitting the railroad, Gills Branch goes through some tortuous turns and actually almost starts heading back upstream as it tries to make its way through this constriction and then as it goes down, it makes its way across Lover's Lane and down to the Colorado River. So this is a constriction that we dealt with in the model. We tried to we investigated opening up these cross sections starting downstream of MLK about here, and then improving the channel all the way down here, and then widening this bridge opening by 50 feet. So it would go from 80 feet wide to 130 feet wide. And so we went through the same process of mapping that, and that's what this looks like. So I'm going to step up.
The slider right on top.
You got me? So here's in the red hatching is the approximate area where in the model, we opened up the cross section and assumed we widened it and cleared it, and then we opened up the cross section and the opening at the bridge right there. So that's what that red cross hatched. That's the work area or the project area. The pink is the result. Okay, the blue is where the existing, or this guy, existing 100-year floodplain is, and then this is where it is after we applied those alternative modifications to the channel and the bridge crossing. So you can see it visually. I've got it specified on the next slide as far as.
But Dan, it by no means indicates where we would actually improve. I mean, we haven't gone through and checked to see where all the structures are or what kind of physical constraints we would have to actually do that work. It's simply a calculation that was made in the program to understand what the impacts would be.
Absolutely, yeah. We did. We did it in the model world. Yeah. So it's a high level calculation to see what kind of a result we would get.
But I do like that calculation. That's something that I've been talking about for a long time. Matter of fact, Trey and I talked about this, to where the entire channel has changed over the years, to where the water used to go right through under the train trestle over there. And it has, matter of fact, I'm paying taxes on that ditch behind my house. That's exactly behind my house. And I'm paying taxes on that, but it is channeled around where it used to go, right through under the trestle. It's cut into my property, and it's creating a dam there. Wow. And that's why your picture depicts where the railroad came in. They didn't mess around. They put some huge boulders in there, because it almost, the last floods we had almost washed that whole bridge out. But the railroad came in, and they had train lined up for a couple of days. Matter of fact, they worked overnight and put those big boulders in there to keep from washing out again. But that's how much Gills Branch has changed that whole channel going through there, and it's damming up Gills Branch. And those some of the issues, which I like your model there. That's something that we need to address, to where we can put the thing back on track, to where the water can go through and not make a turn and come back again.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's absolutely correct. Because over the years, channels tend to migrate and move around because they're dynamic in nature. And so as we start in development adding these constrictions like road crossings and armored channels, it tends to redirect itself. And that's exactly correct. That railroad berm has created somewhat of an obstruction, and it's redirecting that channel.
So what was the width of the channel that you were proposing, or that you put in your model?
50 up to, I think, I'm trying to remember. Marina, can you?
I think you showed it on that slide.
It's 30 to 50 feet. Oh, yeah. Maybe I'll look at the next slide.
Before you go,
sure.
Just so I'm clear, that pink, what is the pink again?
Yeah. it gets confusing, all the different colors. The pink is the result. So
Well, you said that a while ago. Result.
that's what happens to the floodplain after you put that in the model. Suppose we put in these channel improvements and we open that bridge. That's what the floodplain would look like.
As opposed to the blue. If
So
you don't
it's-
do anything, it's the blue, and after you do that improvement, then it pulls back to the pink. So all of that blue area is now no longer in the
It helps.
floodplain.
It helps the blue then, but it doesn't help the pink.
Correct.
True. The
It
pink is
shifts
what
the
happened.
floodplain, yeah.
And the reason that to the left of those improvements, the reason that hasn't changed, because the problem with the ditch being lower on one side, that's already happened upstream of that. So you can't fix that part by
Gotcha.
taking care of it at the train. Does that make sense? That's why
I
the
gotcha.
pink and the blue is exactly the same up there, and the blue that goes away and is the floodplain that's now only pink. That's the only part that can be impacted by that improvement.
Gotcha.
So that's doing improvements from where the water crosses under MLK to the railroad tracks.
Yes. And a 30 to 50 foot wide is what I remember us using it in between 30 and 50 foot wide
I
channel
thought one
bottom.
slide back you showed the new cross section. I think his next one
You
is
did
the
one
cost
slide back,
estimate.
yeah.
I think the one before
Yeah.
there.
So this is
It's about 35 feet.
this is from the next model, where we talked about that, but it's a little bit. Yeah, this is in the the 30 to 50 range. Yeah. That's real easy for me to look up. So the costs on this, the amount of work for Trey, because Trey's going to get to do it. So widening the railroad bridge an additional 50 feet and the channel improvements from downstream of MLK to downstream of 71. We an estimate of about 2.7 million with a benefit cost ratio of 0.03. So it's a really low, almost non-existent VC ratio. We calculated that by how many structures we pulled out of the floodplain. So we mitigated 3 structures from the 100-year floodplain. And that value that we're using for that calculation is just for the structure itself, not the land and the other things that, it's just the structure. So just to give you a little.
One of the things that before we suck the air out of the room and start just going, oh my God, $2.7 million. Each one of the 3 alternates that they are going to show you assume the other 2 are not going to happen. And so one of the things we have asked for by the time y'all begin to make some decisions in your budget process, that they run a model assuming all 3 happen to see what the benefit cost ratio looks like. I won't tell the end of this story, but it's going to be an epic number, huge. We're going to suck the air out of the room. But if they run the model and all 3 together have a high ratio, then the question becomes you have to phase it so we could eat the elephant one bite at a time. But you have to do it in a way that your CIP reflects it's one of 3 must-do projects. It's 2 of 3 must-do projects, because by themselves, you don't get the benefit, but perhaps all 3 of them make a huge difference. So don't get too hung up on the fact that the benefit cost ratio is not there, because we don't know in totality what these will actually look like. So before you're called upon to make any kind of decision, you will have that information from which to make a decision.
So I think it's fair to point out that you break even at 1. So this is a .03. You're even money at a 1. So it's pretty low on the scale for the amount of money you
How
spend.
do you figure that? How is the benefit cost ratio figured?
It was calculated based on the price of the project and then the value of the structures that were mitigated. So there were 3 structures that went from the that didn't the pink to the blue thing. Well, there were 3 structures in that blue area, and those were ones that were mitigated, and so those 3 added up to whatever 0.3 times 2.7. So that's how that happened.
So said another way, it would be cheaper to buy those 3 structures than it would be to spend $2.7 million to try to mitigate the water from them.
If this is the only option we're looking at. Yeah.
I just want to make a point, because I also live in the FEMA world. The BCA that they're doing is a very basic BCA, because it's only taking into effect what the cost of the structure is. It's not taking into effect every time that structure floods and what it is to put that structure back into that it was at the beginning. So their BCA that they're doing right now is only looking at the price of the structure. It's not looking out in the future how much you're going to save over time, where that structure is not having to be rebuilt over and over and over again. It's not looking into the future of the mental anguish that these homeowners or the property owner is having to do. It's not looking at every time you send a first responder out to help those people. So when you look in the FEMA world, when we do a benefit cost analysis, all of that information is taken into consideration. So it's not just looking at the cost of the structure, it's looking at the future benefits. If we get rid of this structure, or if we protect this structure, whether it's a structural or a non-structural, the FEMA benefit cost analysis takes all of that into consideration. The benefit cost analysis that they're doing right now is just a very basic investigatory type benefit cost analysis. So I don't want you to get hung up in the future on the price of the structure was only $130,000, but if we run it and look at the benefits in the future, it might be $1.2 million, because every time that structure gets lost or has damage to it, it's $250,000 every single time. So you kind of have to think of it in those terms too. So this one is a very basic benefit cost analysis, or a benefit cost ratio that they're generating for you right now. So just keep that in mind in the future.
Thank you, Kathy. And another thing we looked at is the square footage, or the acreage that is reduced from the floodplain. So in this case, it removes 6 acres from the 100-year floodplain. The 100-year floodplain, this guy right here, just for reference, is 107 acres. So it reduces it by 6 acres.
Did you include a value for the property in your BCR, or did you only use the structures?
The structure.
Okay.
Yes. And it was frequency based. It's a little technical, but yes. So
I understand what Kathy was saying over there. We're looking at it from the city's point of view, from the city, and we have to deal with the railroad, we have to deal with FEMA, we have to deal with the Corps of Engineers, and it's on and on and on. But we'll just do what we have to do to try to make a situation better. That's all we can do, and that's what we want to work toward.
Right, so alternative 2, we investigated road crossings and channel modifications. And we looked at the entire reach. So that 3,000 and 4,500 and 5,000 CFS that we talked about earlier, what we did is we tried to keep it in Gills Branch with this scenario. So we investigated what it would take to, and if we had the world, to what it would take to keep everything in Gills Branch. So it would involve channelization from the top to the bottom, and it would also include removing and replacing bridges at Farm Street, Chestnut, Pine, and MLK. So a very major effort. But this time you don't see, you can see the results in that it keeps Gills Branch in the banks. So the pink is the result. And then it doesn't do anything about the railroad track, because the railroad track is still getting flow from above, upper or northern Bastrop, Texas is flowing there. So, but what it does is it takes that, it erases the overflow, and it keeps Gill's Branch in the stream proper.
So in this case, what's happening here is all the flow that's coming to the creek from the northern watersheds is, with a channel benching that we're proposing, will be able to convey the full amount of flow and prevent any of this overflow that's leaving the creek and flooding along the railroad. You can still see there's still a pink area that is being shown, and that flood area is based off all the flow, as Dan had mentioned, all the flow that's coming from the northern portion of the watershed along that ditch, along the railroad. So there's still drainage and runoff that's conveying towards the railroad that is still going to cause some ponding and flooding area along the railroad.
Any questions on this guy? Oh, let's go to the numbers. Sorry. So, alternative 2, road crossings and channel modifications. It's channel clearing and channel modifications from just downstream of Highway 95 to just upstream of the railroad crossing. And it's approximately a 9/10 of a mile of Gill's Branch. And building new bridges at Farm, Chestnut, Pine, and MLK. This guy came in at $7.7 million, and it has a BC ratio of 0.99, which rounds up very nicely to 1 if you're going by the 10th of a decimal. It mitigates 15 structures from the 100-year floodplain. It mitigates 4 acres from the 100-year floodplain, and it keeps flow in Gill's Branch, eliminating that overflow for the 100-year event.
So one thing to note on this alternative with the channel improvements is that total cost includes the construction of the project, a percentage for engineering design, a percentage for permitting, does not include any land acquisition that's required for the drainage easement that would be needed for this alternative.
Or moving utilities, those other construction costs. Let's go to the next one. There's the stormwater detention. So, stormwater detention again is where you want to try and capture the flow before it hits the stream and hold it back and release it at a milder flow rate so that you decrease those peak flows in your stream. We looked at placing a 150 acre-foot detention pond just downstream of Highway 95 and then 190 acre-foot detention pond at the soccer fields. I refer to them as the soccer fields. I bring my kid out here for soccer tournaments a lot, so I think of them as the Bastrop soccer fields. Are they that? Is that what y'all call them? Okay. So, again, this one, obviously the large detention pond on the upper end with the 150 acre-foot detention pond handles that overflow. So it grabs almost all of that. And then you can see the result, the pink versus the blue. And then we've got the model of the other 90 acre-foot detention pond just adjacent to the bend in the river before it makes its way across Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. So this guy, by the numbers, it's construction of one 150 acre-foot detention pond just downstream of Highway 95 and one 90 acre-foot detention pond at the soccer fields with a total cost of $12 million and a BCA of 0.63. It mitigates 16 structures from the 100-year floodplain It mitigates 34 acres from the 100-year floodplain, and overflow from Gill's Branch is reduced by 97 to, or 100% for the 100-year event. So, yes, please.
So does this take into account that whenever it rains here, it doesn't stop? I mean, I've literally seen it rain nonstop for 40 days. And so, I mean, you have a detention pond, and I think you would just be assuming that if you had a detention pond that you would have some sort of relief where you could hold it back. But when you have that kind of epic rain, I mean, I've seen that sort of an event 3 times since 91. So, I mean, speak to that.
Yes, the parameters around the rainfall event that this is modeled on are specified for us. So it's a 24-hour storm, and 10.03 inches of rain fall in that time frame. And the antecedent moisture conditions, or the runoff capacity for the drainage basin, is set high, so it's set to run off. So that's what they do, is they define those variables. What you're talking about is back-to-back rainstorms and giant rainstorms, and this does its best to meet that. So they take all the rainstorms that they can evaluate, and then they apply statistics to them, and we use those design storms. So
So to add to what Dan is mentioning is the precipitation data that we are currently using as part of this study is based off a rainfall data set up to 2004. So it does not take into account the recent heavy rainfall that we've recently seen over the past 4 to 5 years. The NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Agency, is currently looking at expanding the data set and changing the precipitation data for Central Texas and the Houston area. This is actually an exhibit that is showing what they're proposing to increase the rainfall depth, and in the Bastrop area, those rainfall depths are going to go up to from 10 inches to almost 12 to 13 inches based off the new rainfall data set, but it's not currently released yet. It's still being reviewed by all the agencies, so we're still using the 2004 precipitation data, but at some point in the future it's going to be released. Municipalities will have to make a decision on how and when they want to accept this rainfall data and incorporate it into their drainage criteria.
So I wanted to ask you, Linda, you said earlier something about we're going to be doing a combination of these alternatives. Can you talk about that a little?
No, my issue was not we were going to do it, but my issue is in order for you to make an informed decision, you need to look at them individually, and then you need to look at if all 3 of those projects were done, what would be the impact. Because the 3 projects total $22.4 million. So if we're going to spend that kind of money, I think you need a bigger return on your investment than what's being showed. And collectively, they will have a different impact on the watershed than if you do them individually. One of the things that Dan and Paul just explained is there is a gazillion factors that impact a watershed and whether or not it works, doesn't work, floods, doesn't flood. So I'm going to steal a little of Wesley's thunder at this point in time because it's relevant. Part of the challenge that we're going to have as a community is deciding what fixed looks like. Because there's never going to be an instance that I think our pocketbook will ensure we don't flood somewhere. So the policy question y'all are going to have to wrestle with is what does fixed look like? And then from that, we can make some determinations about projects and so forth as to how to invest the money appropriately, recognizing that we'll never be able to represent to anybody that we're not going to flood. So this is the beginning of a lengthy conversation, not the end.
Yeah, Dan, I looked at your verbiage on the detention ponds, but do we have the property to build detention ponds up and down Gills Branch?
There are some opportunities, like with Emil, to partner with the school district and use park-like assets. Most of the parks cities own are in floodplains, and that's because it doesn't make sense for them to be anything else. Mm-hmm. One of the challenges on the upstream flooding is the lack of significant detention, so partnering with the school district at the Performing Arts Center might be an option. There are some properties that just make sense that long term we would need to partner with the developer because a lot of their properties probably undevelopable. So in order to get them to work with us, we might negotiate a higher density on that property so that the property that they could develop, they could get their return on investment in by doing that work with us to dedicate some of their property for detention. So I think that there are some right now opportunities that if we had the money, we could work with the school district. But I do think that this is going to be more of a long-term strategic plan. Let's designate some areas where detention has to happen, and as development occurs, you work with the developer at that time.
Okay. Well, thank you. Speaking of long-term, Trey, help me if you will. Dan showed the railroad tussles just over there where the the water has to go through on Gills Branch. But what's the size of that sewer pipe that goes through? That's 2.5 inch, 3 inch. There's a pipe that goes right through there, and it has a tendency to block.
Yeah, I think it's about 15.
15.
I want to say it's pretty good size.
Yeah, it's a pretty good size pipe. And if we get a good rain, you got so much debris that's going down Gills Branch, and it's going to run into the pipe and it's going to block everything back up. It's just going to build a dam over there. So that's something else. I'm just throwing it out there. We're going to address that at some point. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Before y'all transition to Piney Creek, do y'all have any additional questions you want to ask about Gills Branch?
Can you just show those 3 alternative slides just one more time, just, kind of back to back to back?
You bet. Okay. I have paper copies of these too. Oh, great. Yeah. I brought some so we can put them out on the table and everybody can get your hands on them. Yeah.
One more thing, Linda. I work for the city. I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus, but I get asked every day, why are we not in the off season trying to get some of the debris out of Gills Branch on the winter months when everything is kind of dormant? And I don't have an answer to that.
With all due respect, council member, we can clean the debris, but it's not going to change the fact that if we get an epic rain, it's going to flood. And the reason for that is Dan showed you a picture. Gills Branch is actually higher than the railroad track. So when the water comes out, it flows to the lowest point, which is the railroad track, and it dams up. So whether or not there's debris in the Gills Branch is not going to change whether or not it floods. So part of what we pledged to do was to create the drainage fund, and that's still on our list to do. But thanks to the small business revolution for the last 2.5 months, we've been limited on our capacity. But we think that $500,000 we know we're going to win next Tuesday will be worth that 2.5 months. But Part of what that drainage fund would do would help with that routine maintenance. But every time it comes up, you see Trey cringe because it is a false sense of security if we get that 2 million gallon per minute flood rush coming through. That debris is not going to keep it in the banks. And so we absolutely want that maintenance crew to clean the debris, but I think we need to look at that from the perspective when we have a normal rainfall and our drainage operates under normal conditions, that debris being out of the way lets it function. But that debris in unusual FEMA declared floods isn't going to change the fact we're going to flood. So I just want to manage perception, but we are going to talk to you about that drainage fund when we have the capacity to do that. And part of what that crew will do is help clean that debris. We have also sent a request to the warden because they have prisoners that are in a work release program. And one of the programs that we listed in that request was to be able to clean out Gills Branch, particularly from Farm Street to 95, because that's a real challenge that is an annual something that just eats our capacity. So we're looking for every opportunity we can to do routine maintenance. But I just want to offer that clarification to manage expectations.
Okay, great, because I've talked to Trey. Trey's got some great ideas about some things that need to be done along Gills Branch, like covering part of it, which would be nice, to where the water will flow all the way down to the main section of Gills Branch instead of damming up in certain places, because we got a lot of impervious cover up around Popeyes and all the other building that's going in on Mill Street. But I've talked to Trey, and he's got some good ideas, and I try to purvey that to the public, but we're going to keep on telling the folks what we got in the plans. But sometimes people get impatient, and that's what I'm trying to deal with.
Yes, sir, and there has been some work around Popeyes with the church. We've gone in and have put in the drainage swell to take that water out. We've also worked with the TxDOT on the drainage between the back of the church along Popeyes to 71. And we have also identified some drainage pipe that could be installed between the church across the street from a mill down to MLK, so that the water has more than one access point to enter the storm drains at the bottom. But again, that's back to that maintenance crew. So this summer, they installed, I think, 2 other drainage pipes at the church to help capture that water so that it gets drained off before it enters that block section and runs down the hill. But again, that will capture normal rainfall, but if we're getting 8 inches an hour, all bets are off.
Y'all ready to talk about Piney? So Piney Creek is, unlike Gills Branch, a diminutive Gills Branch at 2.8 square miles, Piney Creek's big. It's 39 square miles is its drainage area, and it reaches all the way up just a little bit above U.S. Highway 290 as it makes its way southwest down to its confluence with the Colorado River. We did the exact same thing in the modeling with Piney Creek that we did with Gills Branch. Pardon? Same LIDAR data, same soils data, permeability.
Can you go back to LIDAR?
Yeah. So there's 39 square miles.
So if you need landmarks like I do, that map that's sitting to the right of the screen is a whole lot handier. Or at least it works better for me.
This is the whole watershed, which this map you see right here is the entire watershed. with Highway 290 coming through right up here. So that entire stretch. This map that you see right here that's Highway 95. So this guy, that guy starts about right here, right in here. So we did the detailed channel model for this little stretch. We didn't do the detailed model all the way up the river. Only for that portion of Piney Creek that is in the city limits. So let me get us up to. Go ahead.
Talk about the soils, because this is interesting. No, the next one.
Yes.
This is interesting, and this becomes important not only from the watershed, but I want you to hear what he's talking about because it'll impact our development standards as well.
This is a good map for that discussion. It shows the relative permeability of the soils in Piney Creek, with the more permeability meaning that they can pass water through as opposed to hold water back, like permeability as it increases, it's easier for water to flow through. I think of it as more permeable means it's more sand-like, and then less permeable, it's more clay-like. So the darker the colors you see is more sandy, and the lighter colors would be the more clayey or less pervious. So this gives you an idea how you can guide that make that sort of a decision. These soil data sets are very handy for that.
I think it'd be interesting to go back and look at a comparison of Gill's Branch for the impervious cover. For the soils permeability. And it's interesting to see the difference between the two watersheds. So there, as Dan was mentioning, you've got more permeability around the Colorado River area, where there's more what they call alluvium, loose material that water is able to flow through and into the ground, versus on the hilly type, where you've got more terrain, you've got more clay and more rock up in that area. So with the two different types of soils, if you have more sandy soils, you almost want to lean towards having more, changing your criteria to follow the type of material you have or the soil material, so you can have more infiltration, such as low impact development that allows the storage of water to go through the existing soils and then percolates through the soils into the creek. And so it slows down that runoff. Rather than going overland flow, it slows down that runoff through the soil by the time it gets to the creek, and your peak flow is actually reduced. So it can help depending on the type of soil you have and the type of criteria you have for those types of soil. So LID may be used for the sandy areas and more detention, typical civil engineering type BMPs that are used to slow down water, such as detention, could be used up in the rocky, more clay type materials.
So an LID is a low impact development.
It's all good, right? Another big difference is the land use itself and the impervious cover. It's much more rural than as opposed to the smaller Gill's Branch with its highly urbanized center. So we have a model very similar to the other one, just different in size. This is the hydrologic model for Piney Creek that we ran. And then this is the channel model. So we did the same thing. We calculated the water surface elevation and all these cross sections on that reach of Piney Creek, and then translated those to a map. And it's the map you see right there, and it's also the next slide. So this is great in that up till now, Bastrop didn't have defined water surface elevation is for their reach of Piney Creek. The FEMA floodplain maps were approximate zones, so you didn't have defined elevation. So now we have best available data to work with as development begins to happen in that area. We did take a look at some channelization, trying to improve flow between the Highway 95 bridge and the Main Street bridge, and then downstream of Main Street. This is the channel benching, similar to what we worked with on Gills. And this shows you the area that we modeled, and then the results, which were not as dramatic as what we saw on Gills Branch. I think we were able to only mitigate one structure from the 100-year floodplain by working with that. So at this point, it didn't seem excuse me, it didn't seem we didn't go into the BC calculation on it because it only removed one structure from the floodplain. So that's the story on the Piney Creek study. And from there...
So, Dan,
yes, please.
One thing I would like to mention about Piney Creek, you can tell that there's not as much information that goes along with Piney Creek compared to the Gills Branch study. What is really important about the Piney Creek study is two things. Dan mentioned one is that the current FEMA maps are showing that area as what's called a Zone A, which means that it's just an approximate location of where the floodplain is, which causes a lot of problems when we're trying to figure out where homes can be built, how high they need to be built. Going through this process, we now have much better information and detail to go along with that floodplain area and describe that floodplain area. It also gives us really good information to know what kind of downstream conditions we're going to have to deal with as we look at upstream improvements to try to get water into the drainage system so that it can get into Piney Creek. And so it may not seem like there's a lot of data associated with Piney Creek, but it's very good information that's going to help us a lot in the future.
Would y'all like to see what it compares to with the FEMA maps? We put together some slides to show that, what the new study looks like compared to those. Okay. So this is the study. Okay, this is the study result that we just calculated. And then this is the FEMA 100-year in the bright blue. You don't mind the red or the burnt orange down there at the bottom. That's the 500-year floodplain and the floodway. So the blue is the FEMA 100-year floodplain, that proximate zone. There's the study, there's FEMA, and then this is what it looks like when you compare the two. So our study is the darker blue compared with the current FEMA 100-year.
How many acres did you take out? How many acres is the difference between the two blues?
I did not calculate that.
We have not run those numbers, but it wouldn't be hard for us to figure that out.
Okay. Didn't mean to ask a hard question. Thought, well, that's what you would have done. Okay.
We weren't looking back at the effective FEMA floodplain maps. We were focusing on trying to define what the current existing floodplain is. So the teal color floodplain is a late 80s, 1990 development. The dark blue is today's development based off of the latest information we currently have. But we can definitely get those answers for you all.
I just wondered, I mean, they seem pretty close, and I just wondered what the percentage, if you'd given me the acres and I could calculate the percentage difference, and I was just curious.
But if I'm understanding the color coding, your numbers actually take some property out of the floodplain, correct?
Yeah, do you want to?
Yes, you can see where. So we're inside the FEMA floodplain in lots of different areas. This is a end of study right here, so ours will come up this way, but not that far in that reach. So we stopped there just because technically we didn't have that data, and but same through here. We bring it in, but in this area we're outside, so yes, there's plus and minus.
And you're outside on the north, if you kept going back on the
Yes.
on the west side of 95, you're outside of the
West side of 95?
yeah, right there. Aren't you adding there as well?
Yes. It does look like it, yeah. The flow rates are actually very similar to what I've seen with the letter of map revision in the area. So our flow rates are similar to what other folks have been getting. I would say that the culprit might be the original terrain. That we have much different terrain now, updated terrain compared to what.
For the people watching at home, instead of turning your head, will you turn your body to the mayor so that you're talking into your mic?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, sorry about that.
But Dan, also with your information, there's actually elevations attached to the boundary of that floodplain, is there not?
Yes.
And there wasn't before on the old maps?
No. Paul?
So on the old maps, the way cities would have to determine water surface elevations based off a approximate floodplain zone, they would try to take that floodplain area, overlay it onto a USGS topo map, and try to figure out what the elevation is. Our new floodplains, the floodplains for the city and the county, now have a model behind it that establishes what that water surface elevation is, and we've shared that with the city. So as development starts to happen in this area, you're able to better manage that floodplain and the development that's encroaching into the floodplain and reduce risk.
So Wesley, when you're reviewing permits and stuff, you've got a better idea of the finished floor elevation that they need to be at, right?
That's right. A good example is that Piney Creek Bend subdivision that most of us know about is, yes, right where Dan pointed. And so they've been able to use that information to work into their design and make sure that they accommodate.
Do you have an overlay of the city boundaries? Because
the city boundary is
It's
actually
pretty much
Piney
the whole
Creek.
thing, yeah.
Well, this city limit is the creek, right? No?
Yep, it is.
Not completely.
Oh, okay.
so is this something that we're going to be cooperating with the county on as far as trying to, because I'm wondering how many people are buying property in those areas thinking they're going to be able to develop or.
We're going to get to that in a minute.
All right.
One other just engineering note is this guy that we calculated is just talking about rain and runoff over Cedar Creek. When you get down here, flooding is impacted by the Colorado River. So somewhere in here, right in here, the influence between the Colorado River is what takes over, and it's not Piney, it's Colorado River.
Shall we take a look at Gills and see what the change is?
Sure.
So this is showing our baseline floodplain analysis that we determined based off the latest data that Dan just went through. The orange and the blue is the current effective FEMA maps that show the light blue is the 100-year, the burnt orange is the 500-year. So try to ignore the 500-year. We don't have that plotted and depicted on the maps. So really just look at the changes between the teal color and then our dark blue that we're about to show here. So you can see the old map did take into account flooding along the railroad. And it also, what it didn't take into account is overflow from Highway 95 downstream. It didn't take into account the flow that was leaving the creek and then heading towards the railroad. Our study takes that into account. The old FEMA study basically had no idea how to model that. So they literally drew a line along the top of the bank and called that the edge of the floodplain. But in reality, as y'all have seen during the flood events, that's not what's happening. It's breaking its banks and it's flowing towards the railroad. And that's all we have. And I guess we should have apologized early on because it's engineering and it's hard to make it entertaining to talk about engineering. It just kind of like Linda mentioned, sucks the wind out of everything. But we kind of had to give you a breakdown of what we went through to go through all the parameters to justify our final floodplains.
Paul, just one last question. I'm just trying to get it in my head. We talked about FEMA most of the night, but how does FEMA work with the Corps of Engineers? I thought the Corps of Engineers set the parameters of the floodplain.
Kathy may be able to expand on that, but typically FEMA hires several contractors to do the actual study, from private consultants to the Corps of Engineers. Mm-hmm. I think what you may be referring to is maybe a feasibility study that they looked at to potentially reduce floodplain in the area.
Expand the floodplain. Yes.
They wanted to expand.
Yes.
We don't have that report or any knowledge of it. So, but typically FEMA and the Corps tend to work together. Early on, FEMA and the Corps worked together to start some of the initial studies on the watersheds, and then eventually the Corps backed out due to some, I don't remember, it was funding issues. But we did, early on, as part of this grant, worked with the Corps of Engineers. They handled the hydrology, half handled the hydraulics, and we brought it together to do the final floodplain mapping. But we didn't do any study at that time on gills. So that's why we're not aware of that Corps study.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Mayor and Council, we'd like to take these out of order. And so while we're focused on the actual study, Wesley's going to walk us through where do we go from here, because that's important.
So Dan and Paul just talked about 3 different projects that total $22.3 million. That's an awful lot of money. And so once we went over this report, we started talking about how do we, one, define the problem that we need to deal with. We all know that it's a flooding issue, but there's different levels of flooding, and flooding means different things to different people. We also want to look at the things that we can't control. What are the issues or the physical constraints that we have no control over or very little control over? Then we looked at what we can control. What kind of opportunities do we have, and what kind of options do we have to make flooding issues less impactful in the community? And then once we look at that, we also want to think about what we can do about it. What can we do about those issues that we can control? And then what does that get us? Once we do what we can to deal with those issues, what kind of benefits do we see? And so as staff, Trey and I have spent a lot of time looking at this. When we think about flooding, I said before, it means different things to different people. And so we we feel like when water is reaching a level or an area that it's not designed, or that's not designed to handle that water, and it starts impacting the health and safety of the public, that's when we feel like we're seeing major flooding. And these are some examples of some of the homes that flooded in the 2016 flood. And so these are obviously what we would consider major flooding problems. Here's this was Shiloh Road in 2016, and you can see with the road washing out, that has a huge impact on emergency responders and evacuations, and when people cannot get to where they need to go, that's a major problem. But when we look at other types of, what some people would consider flooding, we feel like it may look scary, but we don't really go as far to say that it's a major flooding issue. It's more of an inconvenience or a nuisance, and that could be something like these low water crossings that are designed to flood. They're designed to have water over it. They're not necessarily a problem because of that. Now, it could be a problem if that's your only access point. But you could also have situations where water is flowing through, like this middle picture where you have water flowing under a bridge. Yes, the water is very high in the channel, but it's still able to handle that water. So when we talked about what the issues that we can't control, of course, we can't control Mother Nature. We can't control how much rain we get and when we get those rain events. Can't really control what was built before. We can't go back and rebuild properties and change what was built a long time ago. We also can't control a lot of development within Bastrop County. Through the studies, these watersheds extend outside of the city. In the case of Piney Creek, it extends very far outside of the city. We have very limited control over what goes on. We do have jurisdiction over subdivisions and the infrastructure that goes along with those subdivisions.
It's important to note that counties do not have the same authority statutorily from the state to regulate development that municipalities do. So for folks watching at home going, well, the county just ought to regulate it. They'd love to, but they can't.
And then we also have natural and man-made barriers. The railroad's probably the biggest barrier that we have is with the Gills Branch watershed, because this picture does a really good job of really highlighting how much of a damming effect it has when water's trying to flow through there. We also have, Highway 71 is also a barrier. They're just those natural and man-made constraints that we can't really do much about. Now, when we get into what we can control, we can control how we prepare and how we respond to the emergencies that are created by these storm events. Trey's talked about before all the maintenance that's done on the system, how much work we do to prepare for those emergencies. We can also control the regulations that we have inside the city limits. And so when we look at flooding impacts, you're mainly looking for impervious cover regulations, because that has a huge impact on how much runoff is actually produced. And then we can look at what kind of mitigation requirements development should have in order to lessen the impact that their development has on downstream areas. And then we also have the ability to regulate areas inside the floodplain. And so we do have jurisdiction to limit where structures are built and how high they're built to when it comes to building inside the floodplain. We also can control a lot about how we respond to flood events and how we deal with damaged structures after the event. And so this is what could impact existing developments, because just because your property is safe today. If there is a flooding event and your home is, or that structure is damaged, we're required by FEMA, because we participate in the flood insurance program, to actually go out and assess the level of damage that's happened in that structure and determine whether or not it's safe to remain in its present condition, or if it has to be relocated or elevated or removed.
Wait, so talk about that a little bit more. So,
I skipped forward a slide, and I'll go back to the other one. But so the city participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, and that is the major program that writes flood insurance policies within the community. And so in order to participate in that program and be eligible to have flood insurance policies written for properties within the community, there's certain requirements that have to be met. One of those requirements is that we adopt a floodplain management ordinance that has restrictions on what can be built inside the floodplain, and if a structure is built inside the floodplain, it has to be built in a certain way to either be outside of a flood hazard or be built in a way that that limits the damage that's caused to that structure during a storm.
so do we have something like that?
We do, and
Is it adequate?
It's definitely more than a lot of cities do. The main requirements when it comes to developing inside the floodplain is knowing what the 100-year, what we call the base flood elevation, and that is it's the elevation that the water would get to during a 100-year storm. And so most cities, a lot of cities require that structure to be built at least 1 foot above that elevation. Our ordinance actually requires it to be built 2 feet. And so it's higher than what a lot of cities do. It could obviously be more, but I would say it's adequate.
Question for you right quick, Brennan. What's the city's stance on flood insurance? Because when I bought flood insurance, I was told I had to go get an elevation certificate. So I had to hire a surveyor to come in and get an elevation certificate during that time. And it's been a few years back. And I found out after the fact that when I finally got my flood insurance, they told me I did not need an elevation certificate. But that was $600 later.
Different insurance companies have different requirements for establishing and signing up for a flood insurance policy. Sometimes there's just a lot of variables. Some insurance companies, depending on where your house is or how high it's built up and how it relates to the floodplain area, they may have more requirements than others.
And mine was 2 feet above, but I was told that I need an elevation certificate, and I did not need it later after I found out.
I'm glad Kathy's here.
Okay, thank you.
I might be able to answer that question for you. So it's not really the insurance companies that are requiring it. It is a requirement nationwide that if you get a federally backed mortgage, that if your structure is located in a floodplain as delineated by the FIRM maps or the flood insurance rate maps, then you have to purchase, it's mandatory purchase of flood insurance. And so those lenders might require that you get an elevation certificate so that they can, when they go to get the flood insurance for your structure, for protecting their assets, which is the loan that they given to you so that you can have your house, they use that to determine what your first floor elevation is, or where your first structural member to your structure is, whether you be a pier and beam house or a slab on grade. So what they're going to do is they're going to look at what your first floor elevation is based off of what Wesley was talking about, your base flood elevation, which is the 1% or the 100-year flood event. And that's how they're going to use for rating purposes. And then they have these very ornate rating tables that they go to, and they say, If you're 2 feet above BFE, this is how we're going to rate your structure. If you are, BFE is the base flood elevation. Or if you're 2 feet below BFE, your rate's going to be higher. So that is the reason why they're requiring you to get an elevation certificate to help them for that rating purposes. So it's derived by where you're located. So if your structure, if your community has flood maps that only have zone A's, so Wesley talked about zone A's, there isn't a base flood elevation associated with it. So when they go to rating, they assume the worst. Let's put it that way. So the rates for a zone A is usually going to be a little bit different than if you had an AE zone, which means that there are base flood elevations associated with it. So does that kind of answer your question of to why you need it to get that elevation certificate?
Excuse me. It's a very good answer, but at the time I got some bad information. I'm going to leave that alone.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to touch on something Wesley kind of breezed over a minute ago. Because he has a requirement of over 2 feet in elevation for the base flood elevation, 2 feet over the 100-year. That's exactly what we were talking about when what does a flood look like to you. So if your house is required to be 2 foot above, that doesn't necessarily mean your yard, the street, or any surrounding property has to be 2 foot above the base flood elevation. So when you get that 100-year storm, you're not flooded technically because there's no water in your home. You're high and dry 2 feet above. However, the road's underwater, the ditches are all underwater, there's water right up to your front porch, and everybody gets nervous and scared. But it's not technically what we're trying to define as flooding, and that's the kind of policy that determines the size of infrastructure that we're going to have to put in, what the developers are going to have to do. Can it be 25 year? Does it have to be 100? So I guess to start with the first slide, that's exactly what we're asking is, what does a flood look like to you? Is your street underwater like a flood, or is it your house is still high and dry and it's okay to have a little water in your yard?
So now we know that a little bit more about what we can control. We want to talk a little bit about what we can do about it. You know, what can we do to lessen the impacts that we have experienced over the years and keep them from getting worse. So we kind of divided it up into 4 main approaches. You know, we've got a regulatory approach where it's not necessarily going to do a lot to fix previous issues, but it will go a long way to keep it from getting worse. And so we can look at the various regulations that we have when it comes to design and construction matters. You know, we can control and limit how much runoff a site can produce, and we can also regulate how they handle that runoff within their site. You know, another approach is channelization, and Paul and Dan went over several projects that would improve the carrying capacity of our drainage system so that it's helping to get that water in and out as quickly as possible. And so when that channelization work is not enough, your next go-to option is storage or detention ponds. And that's just giving the water somewhere to go when those channels become overwhelmed. And so we want to at least give it somewhere to go before it actually starts getting into buildings and causing structural damage and major financial damage. The next would be mitigation, and that's when we're talking about, instead of talking about removing structures that are at risk from that flood hazard. You know, getting structures out of the way of those hazards so that they can't become damaged again. So when we talk about our development regulations, you know, the 3 main things we would look at is promoting and encouraging low impact development. And what I like about low impact development is it's a very holistic approach to designing a site, and it really goes a long way to kind of mimicking that natural condition. That's what the ultimate goal of low impact development is. And so when you have low impact development, it really it just really limits how much water even leaves the property. So we also look at the other design criteria when low impact developments either not used. We look at what kind of rainfall events, what kind of rain events, what kind of design storms that system has to be designed for. We also look at building codes to make sure that the structures are built in an area that's appropriate.
Shameless plug for those watching at home, the last 15 minutes to vote for Bastrop Season 3, Small Business Revolution Main Street. Just 15 minutes. Every vote counts. www.smallbusinessrevolution.org. Please vote. Thank you.
Get a text from Sarah.
Yeah. We can take a recess now.
That they will tell you I have been dogging them since last Tuesday. Every day they get my email. Big bold letter. Please vote.
Other options we have, and Ms. Kathy's going to talk about this a little bit more in a second, but we can also update the FEMA maps that we have. We can update the rainfall rates. Paul mentioned that a little while ago. And that helps us really consider the impacts of development that's occurred over the years, and helps us keep our standards up to date so that we're designing things appropriately. And then we can also, of course, maintain our drainage system, that it operates as efficiently as possible. Trav, I'll let you talk about this because that's where.
So this slide, what we were talking about was how important it is to get the water to the creek as well. You're going to have some drainage that's going to be, you're going to put in this large system. You possibly spend this $22 million. And that's going to have to be maintained. There's going to be a lot of local areas that need small work like this, just to make sure that when we do have a large event and the rainfall rate is so fast that this can handle and make sure it's conveyed to the creek or to the waterway or to any channel that we've built to get it to that to the ultimate Colorado River. So these are just some examples of what the guys have done on the north end of town.
So now we're at the good part. We've gone over all of these things that we can do, what we can't control. We've got $22.3 million in projects so far. We're really hoping to get some direction on what we want to define the word fixed to mean.
And please note that we're not asking you to do this tonight. This is where we go from here as a part of this drainage study. So between now and July, we will be having some additional conversations about what to do with drainage. We also have a Saturday retreat in March on water and sewer. In April at the mid-year budget workshop, Trey is going to have a presentation on the pavement condition index of our streets and a plan to begin to address those. Each one of these are pretty significant ticket items. And so part of the challenge that you get to wrestle with as policy is where do we best apply our money and in what order, and then how do you make those decisions from a policy standpoint. So as wonderful as this study is, it answers a lot of questions, but it also creates as many questions to be answered as it answered. So just know that we're going to have some policy conversations, absent pictures, absent projects, and just wrestle with, as a community, what does fix look like? So that we can then begin to make some decisions relative to what projects meet those conditions and hire a consultant to help walk through that process with the community. Because the easy part is the engineering. The difficult part is managing the expectations of the constituents, because fixed doesn't matter until it's my ox being gored in the ditch. When it gets real personal, then fixed becomes really important. So I think the community has to take the journey and understand that whatever the answer is fine. It just comes with the price tag. And fixed will be commensurate with our pocketbook. So that's the journey we have to take in order to be able to resolve this. So what I wanted Trey and Wesley to do tonight was to begin to tell you the complicated conversation that we're going to have in the next few months. So as you process the presentation that Dan and Paul have given you, it's not just 3 projects. It's way bigger than that. So just know in the coming months, we'll be coming back and beginning to take the journey to answer this very question of what does fixed mean. Every project we do reduces that impact. One of the things we've not talked about tonight is North Bastrop. Wesley is working with an engineer, and again, it's a capacity issue. We owe the engineer some information so that he can look at North Bastrop, because much like Trey showed you the pictures of the localized drainage issues, that's a lot of what happens in North Bastrop. The water has to go too far before it can find an inlet. So we need to make some improvements to accessibility of our drainage. And we need to build some detention pond, because when Piney Creek backs up, storage becomes critical. So every one of these is a challenge. Every one of these kind of is a puzzle. So just to manage expectations, this will be the journey that we'll have to take to put together that CIP that we're working on adopting as a part of our budget process.
But Wesley, and I am absolutely looking for council input as well, I am more than prepared to tell you tonight that water in somebody's yard is not flooding. And the definition that you guys talked about as far as public health and safety, and weathermen aren't perfect, but for the most part, big, heavy downpours are not something that happens without a little bit of warning. And you may be stranded in your house for several hours, but the price tag is based on the definition that you guys have. And if we change that to, I don't want water in someone's yard, it doesn't go up a little bit, it goes up exponentially. Right. So I am comfortable with saying if there's not water physically inside someone's home, that's not flooding. That's, to your point, that can be scary, and it's rising, and I don't like this feeling, but that there has to be a cutoff point, and I'm comfortable with the one that you guys have defined. Council, do you have any comments?
I agree with you.
I totally agree, and I just want to say, been on a off-season, I say off-season because we're not mowing any grass now, but just a little bit of maintenance on Gill's Branch would help a whole lot. Just a little, it don't take a whole lot, but just kind of clear the basin out of these waterways, and a little bit ounce of prevention would help us tremendously.
I agree, Councilmember Peterson, and we all realize that it's not the 100-year storm it's not going to prevent that impact. It's the tiny storms that, with the huge impact, that's part of why I think our phones ring. Would you agree with that, Councilmember Peterson? So, and particularly, it doesn't seem like that much of a rain. I'm seeing water where I haven't seen it before, and when I look at the channel, I'm seeing an 8-inch tree. That combination forces people to make a phone call. So that little bit of maintenance can kind of be, I think, beneficial to everyone.
Let me ask you this. So is that kind of in the plan, that cleaning up, is that in the plan at all?
We talked about, as a part of budget, doing a separate drainage utility and doing the $3.50 a month. Part of the charge was we have to get out and communicate and do all of that, set up the drainage fund. That is on our radar, but not to make excuses. We've dealt with chickens. We've dealt 2.5 months with the small business revolution. And so it's just, if you tripled my staff, I could get to that. But it's us, and some of us are sleeping about 4 hours a night right now. So that is going to be one of the things that we're going to work toward addressing before budget and educating the public on that, with hopes that we can get that staff hired. Because remember, part of what we talked about with the drainage fund is that it would have a 4-person crew, and that there are 4 sections or 3 sections of town, I think.
Yes.
And that crew would rotate and do that routine maintenance that we know is important. So we haven't forgot about it. We get close and something happens. But we're honestly working on it. And I actually thought that the drainage fund ordinance would be on the February 27th agenda for the second reading. Did I mention the small business revolution happened about February? So my entire calendar work plan is going to shift 2 months, which is also why we've not talked about chickens again. But we'll get to it.
Well, and early on in the budget year, we developed some priorities that everybody wanted to work on, and that was the signage, the sidewalks, and things of that nature. So we can't do both, which is the whole point of the drainage fund and hiring the extra staff. But we'll certainly do something if we know a storm's coming or prior to. Yeah. I will say that some equipment has been purchased that'll make it much easier already. So that'll be huge.
Huge step in the right direction.
Yeah.
I just wanted to give you guys that feedback on defining flooding, because that would if we make that huge policy change, that completely changes your study and your development going forward. So I didn't want you to bring us back something if you guys aren't. But not everyone spoke, but I think everyone's agreeing to that definition.
One thing I want to say, and that is, I agree with the basic definition, but shouldn't we temper it a little bit so that it doesn't, we're not saying it doesn't get in the house, it doesn't adversely affect the structure of the house.
Yeah, and even so instead of using terms of like 100-year storm or 50-year storm or 2-year storm, which is just your average rain, or something of that nature, let's talk about how fast the rain falls. That's your main issue. It's your rate. So you can get a 100-year storm in 5 minutes if you get 1.5 inches of rain. So 1.5 inches in 5 minutes is epic. 1.5 inches over 4 hours is nothing. So it all depends on the rate and what your infrastructure can handle and how fast it can get it to the river. So that's when we're talking about the development and what that costs, and because the impact between the 25-year infrastructure and 100 for your developers changes your whole cost of obtainable housing, everything. It all affects everything down the line. And like you said many times, that's where the workforce goes to sleep at night. So every decision you make at this policy level affects every other decision all the way down the road. So we just want to all be in the same, rowing the boat together. So.
Good.
Next.
Okay, so our final presentation is going to be to receive the present.
Yeah, we had more slides.
Oh, you did?
This is some good news.
Oh.
So one thing we did want to do is just kind of quickly go through the projects that we do already have a good head start on. A lot of projects that would make a big difference. We actually last week received preliminary grant approval for several of the projects that we've applied for hazard mitigation grant program funding through. So it includes the Public Works detention pond, some work within the channel along Pine Street, which is within Gills Branch. Also got approved for the Jasper and Newton Street improvements and a buyout of one property. And so here's just some slides that kind of illustrate these different improvements. So the Public Works pond is actually in the Piney Creek watershed, and so it'll really help the folks that have flooding problems downstream of Public Works from Hill Street all the way to Piney Creek.
So, and just a note, that pond is built for a 10-year storm. So, and the changes they would make would be a 100-year storm. So, a larger, 26 feet deep. Yeah.
And I think that scope of magnitude is important. So, the depth right now is what?
Oh, 12 feet maybe. Yeah.
And we're going to go to what?
38.
Okay?
Yeah.
So we're building a huge hole. So part of that also comes with the risk and how you mitigate the risk and all of that. But even at that, if it's a huge rain, it's still going to flood. So I'm going to become that broken record because we never want to leave the impression with the public that we're going to spend $560,000 and you're just not going to flood North Bastrop again. It will change when you flood. But if we have the rainfall that we've experienced over our holiday floods in the past, there's still going to be people that flood.
So this is my question. Maybe y'all can answer this because I know there's rules of mitigation. When you take out certain amount of dirt, you have to put it anyway. There's a balance when you're taking it out in areas that flood. Do you know what
normally inside? That's normally for areas inside the floodplain.
Okay. So
Yeah, and this is located further upstream or outside of the floodplain. So as the city is looking at making this detention pond larger and deeper, it's not affecting the storage or fill within the floodplain itself.
are there? Okay. So are there any projects that require dirt though? I mean, as part of what you're doing, are there any areas to be built up for? I guess what I'm saying, are there offsetting projects for the amount of dirt that you're going to be removing?
Potentially,
Yeah, potentially.
If this isn't funded, is it?
If we've got the preliminary funding, and what you'll see is that $560,000, but our requirement is 25% match of that. So we're really not going to pay. That's the total cost.
And that's if it's approved.
And that's if it's approved, we would pay 25% of that.
Okay. So should it be approved, then we would factor that into the project to see how we could offset that. Because in some instances, you could sell that dirt and help offset the cost. So it may not be that we give it to somebody to mitigate a problem. It might be we sell it to help generate some money.
Right. Well, I just thought there might have been some sort of plan to build up areas that otherwise you couldn't build in. I don't know.
a lot of times there's projects that just are under construction during the time that we would be pursuing this project, and so. As Linda said, we could either sell it to somebody. Sometimes we can use it. It just really depends. Here's just a quick look at it's a little hard to see, I apologize, but this would be improvements to the channel that runs along Pine Street between Highway 95 and MLK. And then this is another project where we would actually be, we're actually working with TxDOT on this as well, but it includes replacing the two culverts that flow underneath the railroad tracks to upsize them so that they can carry more water. It also includes putting in some channel improvements and redoing the intersection at Jasper Street and MLK to help reroute some water to another culvert crossing. Today, all that water wants to go to that northern culvert, and this would actually help distribute that flow more effectively.
So, and just to put that in perspective, it's a 42-inch culvert now. Is it going to a 77 underneath? It's two 42-inch, and it's going to be a 277-inch.
And so TxDOT's actually worked that into the design of the new frontage road phase, and so they're actually going to do the work and work with the railroad, which is great, to get that work done, and we're just participating.
Quick question. Yeah, I go again. But that's really going to help a lot if TxDOT comes and helps us with that, because I don't know if there's anyone applying for the vacant corner on the Jackson and 71. That vacant lot there that they started to put something over there and they quit, but that's going to give us more impervious cover. That's going to put a lot more water in that particular area.
Yes,
so,
sir.
But no one's applying for that yet.
No, I think they submitted an application but then withdrew it.
Okay, all right. Thanks.
I don't believe we have any current plans for that. And so, just going back to what we're defining as that word fix to mean. The more we go into that, the more work we do, it's going to get us fewer structures that are at risk of flooding. It's going to improve our emergency response times. It's going to potentially give us more public amenities. Dan and Paul talked about these detention areas that could also function as a public amenity, such as a soccer field.
And then to add to that, if you do channel benching, based off your comp plan, there is a trail that's being proposed along Gills Branch. You can tie the floodplain, the flood improvement with park improvements and have a trail to connect north and south parts of the city.
Right. So you have a bioswale or something that's, yeah.
It could also potentially get us lower flood insurance rates, because going back to that flood insurance program that we participate in, the more we do that's above the minimum standards, we get discounts on flood insurance policies. And then peace of mind, which is always nice. So this is just, we wanted to get in a little bit to kind of show you how widespread some of these flooding issues have been. This is a map showing the properties that it says flooded, but there were different levels of damage that were caused. But it was, I believe, 79 residential properties and 17 commercial properties.
And the overall result of people that actually got water in their house was at 6?
Yeah, 6 or 7, yeah.
So out of that 79 people reported flooding, 6 actually got water in their home.
So that kind of gives you the range of, what.
Which is why we wanted to find.
We want to consider flooding and what.
Was that flooding concentrated in a particular area?
A good part of it was at the north, the north end of the map, where that detention pond would go a long way to make the difference. I think there are 28 properties affected there, and that would pretty much take care of that. And Mr. Jefferson, yeah, he actually probably impacted the most. But you saw the picture in the first slide. That 3-foot watermark on the side of his house was his house. Yeah.
Got to share this with you guys. It's kind of crazy. I'm running around town checking on everybody else that's got flooded. I never looked in my shop in the back where I got like 8 inches of water in my shop behind the house, and I never noticed it. I'm running around checking on everybody else. Yeah, but it wasn't bad. I lived through it. But a lot of people got a lot of water in their homes. Mm-hmm. They sure did. Yeah.
So Trey mentioned this earlier. We could go in and do about as much work as we want, and it's still not going to protect us from every storm and every issue. And so Trey mentioned that a lot of it has to do with how fast that rain falls and the period of time that it falls in. We've shown you this graph before, but it kind of illustrates how we can have a lot of rainfall over a long period of time and not see much damage, but then we can have some other events that may drop a lesser amount of rain but cause more damage. And so some of those graphs on the left of that green line were 3 of the events that we actually had more damage, and the other ones we actually got more rain over that storm, but it didn't cause near as much damage. So this was just a video. Trey, I thought this was neat, but it kind of
so that explains porosity, yeah, or permeability of the soil. Sorry, if you look to the left, you've got a sandy a loam and then a clay loam, and you can just see how much quicker the water soaks through, which is going to be huge with this map that they showed you at Gill Branch earlier, and how you decide what your future development will be. So it'll all be related to the soil condition. That's it. That's pretty much all.
Yes, voting has ended. So, Kathy, if you would now tell us what all this means.
That might be kind of hard to do. I my realm is mitigation. So after the engineers do all their stuff to tell us what the risk is, then I get all kind of giddy because that's just my thing. And I always start out with mitigation isn't just one solution. So I really do like your idea of what does fixed look like to us, and having a very heart-to-heart conversation with the city of Houston after Harvey, that it's not just going to be one thing that's going to be your solution. So the first thing I want to kind of just briefly touch on, and that is, you've done the study now, you've identified your risk. So the first step in any process is to identify the risk. And so the study that y'all have done is identifying the risk. So what's the next step? Well, the next step would be to get it to put on the flood insurance rate map. And so that's kind of where this information is going right now. FEMA has already started on their side to start looking at this right now. So they're taking their first steps. And it's my understanding that HAP is actually the one who is doing the first steps. There's another piece to it, which the Texas Water Development Board is assisting in right now, and that's because we are a cooperating technical partner with FEMA. And so what that basically means is that FEMA provides us funding so that we can start doing the mapping process to kind of push things along a little bit quicker than if it were to go through the normal mapping process with FEMA. And so they have identified the Texas Water Development Board as one of those technical cooperating partners. And so what TWDB has done is we have leveraged what has already been put forth in this flood study, the Bastrop flood study, and have received some funding from FEMA so that we can do the further studies that are necessary in order for these maps, in order for this information to be put on the firm maps. And so as part of that process, the Texas Water Development Board has gone through our procurement process to secure 2 engineering firms that can assist us with this. Those 2 engineering firms have been selected. We're in the process of finalizing our contracting with those 2 engineering firms. And then once those engineering firms have executed their contract with the Texas Water Development Board, a task order will be issued. And part of that issue is to do the further studies that are needed, the engineering studies that are needed, in order to provide FEMA with a complete data set so that they can put this information on the flood insurance risk map. It's not a quick process. Nothing seems to be a quick process these days. But in the realm of things, if we were to wait to FEMA to be able to get to that point, it would probably be 5 to 8 years. What y'all are looking at is more of an expedited type situation to where it could be 3 to 4 years if everything goes accordingly. So that's kind of where we are right now with the how to get this information to FEMA so that it can be put on the flood insurance rate maps. The next kind of portion that I wanted to kind of talk to you is, now that you've come up with solutions, you've identified the risks, and you started developing alternatives. So we have to look at it kind of as an alternative as mitigation solutions. So you'll hear the engineering world call it alternatives. I call them mitigation actions. Everybody has a little bit different terminology. But in the FEMA world, and that's the world that the Texas Water Development Board functions in most of the time. In the FEMA world, the Texas Water Development Board, administers the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program on behalf of FEMA. And that grant program can provide financial federal funds to a community to implement projects such as the ones that were described in this study. And also it has others. So it does, besides doing drainage projects, it can also fund things like acquisitions, so buyouts where the property will be acquired and demoed and the land be allowed to turn back to its natural space or open spaces. It will provide funds to elevate structures. So if a structure is sitting 2 feet below BFE or 1 foot below BFE, it will provide funding so that the community can help assist that homeowner to elevate the structure out of the floodplain. So it's just their yard that's flooding. It's no longer the home. There's another one called mitigation reconstruction. It was also coined back in the day, demo rebuild, where you take a non-compliant structure, one that Wesley kind of mentioned, that has had repeated floods or has a flood event to where it's declared substantially damaged, and it'll allow you to demo that structure and rebuild it back into compliance on that property. So those are some of the type of mitigation actions that can be funded through the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program. There's also a lot of other, like I said, mitigation is multi-pronged. There's multiple facets. It may be cleaning out the ditches. It may be doing some acquisitions. It may be doing drainage. It may be elevating some structures. It may be community outreach, informing the community, letting them know what their risks are, letting them know that during a flood event, this road is going to be shut down, but it's okay because there's another access point. Mitigation is multifaceted. And so given that, there's multiple streams of funding available out there. So besides the federal grant program that the Texas Water Development Board has that we administer on behalf of FEMA, we also have the Flood Protection Planning Study, which has expanded what you can do with those funds. One of those is early warning system can be used to do that. So not only can you do the flood studies, you can also do early warning systems. The amount of stuff that we can do is growing in that grant program as the need is there. Another one is the Texas Water Development Board. I used to have to stand up before every presentation, and I had this memorized speech that my boss told me I had to say, and the Texas Water Development Board is the state agency responsible for disseminating flood, water-related blah, 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 blah. We're a mini financial institution. So we have other funding sources just besides federal funds or FEMA funds, but we also have EPA funds, the Clean Water, that can be used to fund particular projects like this. It can be done as a loan or a grant, and I have brought information on all of these grant programs with me. I have little handouts that y'all can come and get. We try to put the whole entire program on 2 pages, front and back. And then we also have all the different loan type programs and other grant programs that we offer at the Texas Water Development Board, and it's just a little snippet of information. There is also other grant programs like through the Corps of Engineers. They also have some funding that can assist with projects just like this one, and it's called the Continuing Authorities Program. It's a little bit longer process than these grant programs or loan programs would be, but there is that funding. You also heard mentioned that y'all received a hazard mitigation grant, which is also under the same grant program as the flood mitigation assistance. That one is out there, and that's administered through our sister agency, the Texas TDEM, the Texas Department of Emergency Management. We are receiving a very large sum of funds associated with Harvey, and that grant program is about to open if it hasn't already opened so far. That will also assist communities in doing these type of mitigation actions. So, I was asked to come to talk to you about how do we get this information to the flood insurance rate maps, and then what are additional funding options out there to help leverage your community's money along with federal and state funds to be able to implement these type of mitigation solutions that you have. So I hope I answered those questions. I tried to do it very quickly because it is late and y'all have been given a lot of information.
We just need one of those agencies' checkbooks. If you could leave a check, we'd be set.
I used to work for TCEQ, and it's definitely a different world. I've been working for the board almost 10 years now, and when I would come to a community from TCEQ, the doors would lock up and be boarded up. And when my very first meeting with the Texas Water Development Board, I was asked, so did you bring us a check? I was like, what? And they were like shaking me and giving me hugs, and I'm like, what? I'm not used to this. So it's definitely a different field. But the Texas Water Development Board primary focus is to help communities such as the city of Bastrop with funding needs, whether for anything related to water and water development and controlling water when it comes to flooding.
Thank you very much for the information. I appreciate that. I would, Linda didn't even pay me to say this. The other part of that is we do not have someone on staff that writes grants all the time. And as you can imagine, they don't just dole out money because somebody writes a 2-line email, gee, we're a really good community and we could really use the money and we'll use it in a good way. So although it's a funding source, it's another part of the process that has to be combined with the effort to gather to get that information and to be able to apply for those funds. The fact that we've already got the hazard mitigation grants, they're really good at making sure their project matches the grant, but I'm thrilled that there's that many programs, but that's also a bandwidth for the staff that we have. So, City Manager, I believe we have gone over all three things. Council, do you have any questions for these experts? I would like to give you a round of applause. Thank you so much for your time. Councilmember Jones, did you have a question?
I just wanted to thank Linda for coming in and just really prioritizing so many things that we never had gotten a grasp on. And I just, again, I'm just really happy. You're doing a great job. I appreciate you very much.
Yeah, hand for staff as well. Thank you. Good job.
Yeah,
Wes.
it's a serious team effort. Yes, ma'am.
All right, it's 8:19. We're not taking any action or anything, so I think we can adjourn without Mayor Pro Tem Schiff making the motion. So it is 8:19, and we are adjourned. Thank you very much.